1844, a French painter fled the Cypress Hollow plantation in terror, leaving his work unfinished. He hadn't seen a ghost. He had seen something far more disturbing. He was hired to paint the portrait of Isabel, the wealthiest heiress in Natchez. But every time he looked into the shadows behind her, he saw her exact duplicate staring back. This duplicate was Miriam, the enslaved girl who scrubbed the floors. They shared the same face. They shared the same bone structure. And as a secret diary would later reveal, they shared the same bed. But the terrifying story we're about to uncover is not just about a forbidden romance between a mistress and a slave. It is the forensic reconstruction of a psychological torture chamber designed by their own father. A man who didn't just own slaves, he bred his own children as a cruel experiment to see if blood was stronger than chains. And he forced them to live as distorted reflections of one another, one in the light, one in the dark, just to watch what would happen. He thought he was playing God. He didn't realize he was creating a two-headed monster that would burn his legacy to the ground. Tonight, we open the Black Ledger to reveal the only case in American history where the laws of nature, the laws of the church, and the laws of the South were all broken in a single night. Subscribe to Before the Story. Turn on your notifications, because what we found in these archives proves that the most dangerous bond isn't love, it's shared trauma. The year was 1844, and the air along the Mississippi River hung heavy with humidity and the scent of decaying magnolia. In the ledger of county tax assessments for Natchez, the Cypress Hollow estate was listed as one of the premier holdings of the region, a sprawling expanse of cotton fields and cypress swamps, governed by Silas Harwood, a man locally referred to as the Baron. The inventory of his assets, preserved in the Adams County Courthouse, details a life of opulence built upon the backs of 200 enslaved souls. The list includes imported French furniture, a library of classical literature, and thoroughbred horses. However, amidst the cold calculation of property, one entry stands out, struck through with violent, heavy ink strokes. Miriam, age 21, house servant, withdrawn from valuation. This bureaucratic scar on the page serves as the first indication that the order within Cypress Hollow was unraveling. Silas Harwood was a patriarch of the old breed, a man who viewed his domain as a separate kingdom where his word was absolute law. Widowed for 2 decades, he raised his only legitimate daughter, Isabel Harwood, in a golden cage of isolation. The few neighbors who were invited to the estate described Isabel as a creature of intense, nervous energy, possessing a beauty that seemed brittle, as if she were constantly on the verge of shattering. She was rarely seen without her personal attendant, Miriam, a woman of the same age whose light complexion and silent demeanor allowed her to move through the main house like a shadow. To the outside observer, their dynamic appeared to be the standard arrangement of the era, a young mistress and her bonded servant, but those who looked closer noticed a tension that vibrated in the air between them. The architecture of the Harwood mansion itself seemed designed to harbor secrets. Built on a bluff overlooking the river, the house was a labyrinth of high ceilings and dark corridors, surrounded by ancient oaks that choked out the midday sun. Letters from visiting merchants describe an atmosphere of oppressive silence, where the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the Baron's study. It was a place where doors were kept locked and curtains drawn, ostensibly to keep out the heat, but in reality to keep the internal life of the family hidden from prying eyes. The Baron's control extended to every aspect of the household. He managed the lives of his daughter and his workforce with the same detached, clinical rigor. Yet, by the spring of 1844, the facade of control was beginning to crack. A letter from the local sheriff to the governor of Mississippi mentions rumors of unnatural disturbances at the Harwood place, reports of lights burning in the upper windows until dawn, and screams that were silenced as quickly as they began. The sheriff noted that Silas Harwood had ceased attending Sunday services and had dismissed the majority of his white staff, retaining only the overseer and the enslaved workforce. This isolation was not merely the eccentricity of a recluse, it was a siege mentality. The Baron was guarding something, protecting a specific order he had constructed within the walls of Cypress Hollow, an order that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain against the encroaching curiosity of the county. The financial records of the estate from this period reveal a curious anomaly. While the cotton yields were high, the Baron was hemorrhaging money on payments to itinerant physicians and specialists from as far away as New Orleans. These payments were not for himself, but for consultations on nervous afflictions of the female mind. No names were attached to these medical expenses, leaving historians to speculate whether the patient was the daughter Isabel or the servant Miriam. The sheer volume of these expenditures suggests a desperate attempt to cure a condition that defied standard medical understanding. It was a frantic search for a scientific solution to a problem that was fundamentally moral and spiritual. Beneath the surface of this declining estate, the relationship between Isabel and Miriam had evolved into something that the rigid social structures of the South had no language to describe. They had been raised in the same nursery, a fact often whispered about by the older enslaved women, but never spoken aloud in the presence of whites. While Isabel was tutored in French and piano, Miriam was taught to sew and serve, yet they slept in the same room, Isabel in the four-poster bed and Miriam on a pallet at the foot. Over time, the physical distance between the bed and the pallet had vanished. The intimacy that grew in that locked room was the inevitable result of two isolated souls clinging to the only mirror they had. The first tangible sign that this bond had crossed a dangerous threshold comes from a discarded draft of a will found in the Baron's fireplace. In it, Silas Harwood attempted to legally bind Miriam to the estate in perpetuity, stipulating that upon his death she was never to be sold, but was to remain under the direct supervision of the executors, locked if necessary. This harsh provision indicates a fear not of Miriam escaping, but of what she represented. The Baron viewed her not merely as property, but as a dangerous catalyst that threatened the sanity and future of his legitimate heir. The atmospheric pressure at Cypress Hollow reached a breaking point in the summer of that year. The heat was relentless, and a fever swept through the river parishes. It was during this period of delirium and confinement that the boundaries the Baron had enforced for 20 years began to dissolve completely. The withdrawn entry in the inventory was not an administrative error. It was a desperate reaction to a discovery that had shaken Silas Harwood to his core. He had walked into a room and seen something that shattered his delusion of control, a moment of undeniable connection between the two women that rendered his authority obsolete. This world, built on silence and separation, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Baron believed he could legislate the laws of nature, that he could use walls and titles to separate blood from blood. But as the investigation would later reveal, the connection between Isabel and Miriam was not learned. It was innate, written into the very marrow of their bones. The macabre tragedy of Cypress Hollow was not that the Baron's daughter fell in love with a slave. It was that she fell in love with the only person in the world who shared her face, a mirror image crafted by the Baron's own secret sins. The first crack in the official narrative of Cypress Hollow appears in the private diary of Miss Prudence Crandall, a governess brought down from Boston in 1838 to refine Isabel's education. The diary, recovered decades later from a boarding house in Massachusetts, offers a voyeuristic and disturbed glimpse into the Harwood household. Prudence, a woman of severe Puritan sensibilities, arrived expecting to tutor a spoiled heiress. Instead, she found herself an unwilling witness to a domestic arrangement she described as suffocatingly singular. Her early entries express frustration at her inability to discipline Isabel, noting that any reprimand issued to the white child was silently absorbed by the enslaved girl, Miriam, who would step between them with a protective ferocity that unnerved the teacher. Prudence writes of the uncanny synchronicity between the two girls, who were 14 years old at the time of her arrival. She noted that they often finished each other's sentences or moved with a coordinated grace that suggested a shared consciousness. "It is as if they are tethered by an invisible cord," she wrote in October of 1838. When Isabel is struck with a headache, the girl Miriam retreats to the shadows, clutching her own temples. When Miriam is sent to the kitchens for work, Isabel paces the parlor floor like a caged animal, unable to focus until the girl returns. It is an affection that exceeds the bounds of friendship and enters the realm of the morbid. The anomaly escalated during the winter of 1839, when a severe fever struck the plantation. Isabel fell dangerously ill, her body racked with tremors and delirium. The local physician, Dr. Benoit, was summoned and prescribed absolute isolation and bleeding. However, Prudence records a chilling violation of these orders. On the third night of the fever, the governess awoke to a strange humming sound emanating from Isabel's sick room. Upon entering, she found the bed curtains drawn back. Miriam was not on her pallet on the floor, but in the bed, wrapped around the feverish Isabel, holding her with a possessiveness that shocked the New England woman. "I attempted to pull the servant away, fearing contagion," Prudence wrote, her handwriting jagged with retained fear. But Isabel, who had been too weak to lift her head for days, sat up with a sudden, violent strength. She looked at me with eyes that seemed ancient and screamed in a voice not her own, a guttural, terrified sound that commanded me to leave them be. It was not the command of a child to a servant, nor a mistress to a slave. It was the primal defense of a single organism fighting to remain whole. The Baron arrived moments later, and rather than punishing the girl, he stood in the doorway, pale as a sheet, and quietly closed the door, leaving them intertwined. This incident marked a turning point in Prudence's tenure. She began to notice other, more subtle disturbances. She recorded that the two girls often spoke in a private language, a blend of French, English, and a dialect she could not identify, a twin speech developed in the isolation of their nursery. She observed them in the gardens, standing for hours by the river, their hands brushing against each other with a familiarity that defied the strict racial codes of the South. To Prudence, this was not merely a lack of discipline, it was a subversion of the natural order, a spiritual sickness that seemed to emanate from the very soil of the estate. The governess also noted the Baron's peculiar reaction to these displays. Instead of the anger one might expect, Silas Harwood watched his daughter and her maid with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. Prudence described him spying on them from the library window, his face pressed against the glass, tracking their movements with the intensity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "He looks at them," she wrote, "not as a father looks at a daughter, but as a sinner looks at his judgment. He knows the source of this unnatural magnetism, and it terrifies him." By the spring of 1840, Prudence Crandall could no longer endure the atmosphere of the house. Her resignation letter, preserved in the diary, cites moral exhaustion and a fear for her own soul. Before she departed, she made one final haunting entry. She described walking past the girls' room late one night and hearing them whispering in the dark. She pressed her ear to the door and heard Isabel say, "We are the same blood, the same breath." If he cuts you, I bleed." The governess fled the next morning, taking the first steamer back to the north, desperate to put distance between herself and the twinned souls of Cypress Hollow. Prudence's testimony provides the first external validation of the bond that would eventually destroy the estate. It establishes that the connection between Isabel and Miriam was present long before the final scandal, and that it was recognized by those around them as something powerful and dangerous. Her observations of the invisible cord and the shared pain suggest that the sisters were aware, on some intuitive level, of their biological link long before they found the proof. They were living out a biological imperative that the Baron had tried to suppress with social laws. The governess's account also highlights the complicity of silence that surrounded the pair. The fact that the Baron allowed Miriam to stay in the sickbed despite the violation of social norms proves that he understood the futility of trying to separate them during a crisis. He knew that Isabel's survival depended on Miriam's presence. This dependence was the weakness he despised but could not eliminate. The diary serves as a testament to the early years of their prohibited bond, capturing the innocence of a love that had not yet been named a crime by the outside world. The visual documentation of this tragedy exists in a single, unfinished artifact stored in the archives of the Louisiana State Museum, a sketch by the itinerant French painter Henri Leclerc, dated 1840. Leclerc had been commissioned by Silas Harwood to paint a formal portrait of Isabel to mark her 16th birthday, a customary practice meant to advertise her marriageability to suitors. However, the final portrait was never completed. Instead, what remains is a charcoal study that reveals the artist's confusion and eventual realization of the house's secret. The sketch depicts Isabel in profile, bathed in light, but behind her, merging into the charcoal shadows, is a second profile, geometrically identical to the first. Leclerc's personal journal, discovered in a collection of artists' papers in New Orleans, provides context for this disturbing image. He writes of his frustration with the commission, noting that Isabel was a difficult subject who refused to sit still unless her attendant was present in the room. "The moment the dark girl enters," Leclerc wrote, "the white girl settles. It is as if the presence of the servant provides the gravity necessary for the mistress to exist." Intrigued by the visual symmetry between the two young women, Leclerc began to sketch them together during breaks, fascinated by the way the light hit their bone structures in exactly the same way. "I placed them side by side to study the jawline," the painter noted in an entry dated November 1840, "and I was struck by a chill. The architecture of the face is the same, the arch of the brow, the curve of the lip. It is the same face painted in two different hues. One is porcelain, the other is copper, but the mold is identical. I began to sketch the shadow girl, Miriam, with the same detail as the heiress. When I filled in the eyes, the resemblance ceased to be a curiosity and became an accusation." The escalation of tension occurred when Silas Harwood discovered the sketch. Leclerc describes the Baron storming into the makeshift studio, seizing the paper, and demanding to know why the servant was being elevated to the level of art. When Leclerc pointed out the artistic interest of their resemblance, the Baron's reaction was violent. "He tore the charcoal from my hand," Leclerc recorded. "He shouted that I was paid to paint distinction, not delusion. He looked at the drawing of the servant's eyes I had just begun to darken, and ordered me to stop. 'Do not finish the eyes,' he commanded. 'She has no eyes to see as we see.'" The Baron dismissed Leclerc that same day, paying him half the agreed sum and ordering him off the property. The unfinished sketch, with Miriam's eyes left as empty white voids, remains a haunting symbol of the erasure Silas attempted to enforce. It is irrefutable physical evidence that the resemblance was visible to strangers, a biological beacon broadcasting the truth that the family tried to hide. The artist's observation that the mold is identical cuts through the social fiction of the plantation. Biology was asserting itself against the Baron's will. Following the painter's dismissal, the estate's records show a tightening of the perimeter. A receipt from a blacksmith in Natchez details the installation of iron bars on the windows of the second-floor nursery. This architectural modification suggests that the Baron was no longer relying on social rules to keep his daughter contained. He was resorting to physical incarceration. The accumulation of anomalous evidence points to a shift in the Baron's strategy, from denial to suppression. He could no longer pretend the bond didn't exist, so he sought to bury it behind iron and silence. Another piece of evidence from this period is a letter from a local dressmaker, complaining that an order for 2 identical silk dresses was cancelled by the Baron, but not before she had fitted both women. The measurements were singular. The dressmaker wrote to her sister, "I have never seen 2 women of such different stations carry themselves with such identical posture. When I pinned the hem on the maid, the mistress winced as if she felt the prick." This shared physical sensation, a phenomenon often reported in twins, was becoming impossible to hide from the tradespeople who serviced the estate. The atmosphere at Cypress Hollow had become one of paranoid surveillance. The Baron began to patrol the grounds himself at night, carrying a lantern and a shotgun, obsessed with the idea that the corruption of his daughter was being observed by outsiders. He fired the remaining house staff, believing they were gossiping about the resemblance. This isolation only served to drive Isabel and Miriam deeper into their shared world. With no one else to talk to, their language, their movements, and their identities merged further. The sketch, the bars, the dressmaker's note, these are not random fragments. They are the debris of a collapsing lie. They document the relentless pressure of the truth, pushing against the walls of the Baron's secrecy. The double portrait that Leclerc attempted to paint was the reality of Cypress Hollow. 2 sisters, one in the light and one in the dark, inextricably bound by the face they shared and the father who denied them. By 1842, the internal chaos of the Harwood estate had begun to bleed into the consciousness of the workforce. The most detailed account comes from the logbooks of Tobias Rourke, a brutal and pragmatic overseer hired by the Baron to maintain order as the household disintegrated. Rourke's logs, intended to track cotton yields and labor disputes, inadvertently became a chronicle of the psychological drama unfolding in the main house. Rourke was a man of the whip and the chain, lacking any imagination, which makes his observations all the more chilling in their blunt assessment of the unnatural situation. Rourke frequently complained in his entries about the special status accorded to Miriam. "The girl is insolent," he wrote in May of 1842. "She walks with her head high, looking me in the eye as if she were white. When I raised the lash to correct her for tardiness, the Baron himself intervened. He did not strike her, but he struck me. He forbade me from ever touching the girl, saying she was reserved for other purposes. It is clear to me now what those purposes are." Rourke formulated the hypothesis common among the men of his station. He believed Miriam was the Baron's mistress, kept for his dark private amusements. This hypothesis, while incorrect, reveals the sexualized lens through which the relationship was viewed by the community. Rourke could not conceive of a sisterly bond crossing the racial divide, nor could he imagine a romantic connection between 2 women. To him, the only explanation for Miriam's protected status and her proximity to the family was that she served the sexual appetites of the master. "The old man keeps her close," Rourke theorized. "He guards her like a jealous lover. It is a sickness of the blood, an old man's perversion." However, Rourke's logs also contain observations that contradict his own theory. He notes instances where Isabel, not the Baron, was the aggressor in defense of Miriam. "The white daughter watches me," Rourke noted with unease. "When I am near the servant, I feel the daughter's eyes on my back from the upper window. It is a murderous intent. She looks at me as if she wishes to see me dead for even breathing the same air as her maid." If the Baron is the lover, then the daughter is the jealous wife. The house is a nest of vipers. Rourke also documented the physical decline of the Baron during this time. He described Silas Harwood as a man eaten by ghosts, pacing the verandas at all hours, muttering to himself. The overseer speculated that the Baron was tormented by the sin of keeping a mistress under the same roof as his daughter. "He is paying for his lust," Rourke wrote. "God has put a madness in him. He cannot separate the two women in his mind. He calls out for one when he means the other." The tension described in these logs suggests a household living on the brink of violence. Rourke records finding strange items near the riverbank, handkerchiefs embroidered with Isabel's initials, tied to bundles of herbs that the enslaved community identified as binding spells. He hypothesized that the women were practicing witchcraft to ensnare the Baron's mind. "They are witches," he concluded in late 1843. "The white one and the black one, they go down to the water and whisper to the devil. They have bound the old man so he cannot move against them." This shift from mistress to witch, in Rourke's hypothesis, reflects the growing fear of the women's power. They were no longer seen as passive victims or objects of desire, but as active agents of chaos. Rourke's fear was not just of their actions, but of their unity. He describes them standing together on the balcony, like two statues carved from the same stone, watching the plantation with a combined authority that undermined his own. The overseer's misunderstanding of the dynamic, mistaking incestuous, sisterly protection for sexual jealousy or witchcraft, serves to highlight the invisibility of the truth. The reality was far more dangerous than Rourke's sordid theories. The Baron wasn't protecting a mistress, he was hoarding a secret. Isabel wasn't a jealous daughter, she was a lover protecting her other half. The murderous intent Rourke felt was the desperate courage of a woman willing to kill to protect the only person who understood her existence. Rourke's logs end abruptly in 1844, shortly before the final crisis. His last entry describes a confrontation in the courtyard where Isabel physically placed herself between Rourke and Miriam, holding a pair of shears. "She held the blade to her own throat," Rourke wrote, incredulous. "She told me if I touched the girl, she would open her own veins on the spot. The Baron watched from the porch and did nothing. He is a broken man. The women rule this hell now." The inevitable collision between the Harwoods' private reality and the public world occurred in the spring of 1844. Faced with mounting debts and the rumors circling his estate, Silas Harwood attempted one final desperate act of restoration. He arranged a marriage for Isabel with Julian Thorne, a wealthy cotton broker from New Orleans. The union was intended to save the estate financially and, more importantly, to socially correct Isabel by removing her from Cypress Hollow and separating her from Miriam. The engagement was announced in the Natchez Daily Courier, and the banns were read at St. Mary's Basilica. The reaction from within the estate was immediate and catastrophic. Church records from the Diocese of Natchez contain a sealed letter addressed to the bishop, written in Isabel's hand. In this extraordinary document, Isabel formally requested the annulment of her own baptism. "I reject the sacraments that bind me to this society," she wrote with a calm, terrifying clarity. "I deny the authority of a God who would sanctify a union I despise. I am already wedded in soul to another, and I will not commit the sin of bigamy to satisfy my father's debts." The bishop, scandalized, forwarded the letter to Silas Harwood. The Baron's response was to implement a total lockdown of the estate. He nailed the windows of Isabel's room shut, and for the first time in their lives, physically separated the women. Miriam was stripped of her house duties and sent to the slave quarters, a collection of shacks on the edge of the swamp, miles from the main house. This separation was the social fracture that broke the stalemate. It was a violation of the unspoken pact that had kept the house functioning. Witnesses from the neighboring plantations reported hearing wailing coming from the Harwood estate at night, not the sound of grief, but of rage. The enslaved workers in the quarters were terrified of Miriam's presence among them. They knew she was of the house and of the blood. Oral histories recorded later by the WPA, Works Progress Administration, in the 1930s, mention a woman named Silent Miriam, who sat in the dirt, refusing to eat or speak, staring fixedly in the direction of the big house. She was like a ghost, waiting to be called back to her body, one elder recalled. The fracture extended to the Baron himself. He was seen in town, disheveled and frantic, buying heavy chains and locks. He told the merchant he was securing his livestock, but the townspeople whispered that he was chaining his conscience. The engagement party, scheduled for late May, was cancelled with the excuse of a sudden nervous collapse of the bride. The Society of Natchez, sensing the rot at the heart of the family, began to shun the Harwoods entirely. Invitations ceased. The credit lines at the bank were frozen. Inside the mansion, Isabel's resistance turned physical. She destroyed the furniture in her room, smashing mirrors and tearing the silk wallpaper. The Baron, unable to control her, resorted to sedation, administering heavy doses of laudanum. But even in her drugged state, Isabel reportedly called out for Miriam, using the private language they had shared since childhood. The separation was causing a psychological amputation. Without Miriam, Isabel was ceasing to function as a coherent human being. The overseer, Rourke, wrote a final letter to the Baron during this time, warning him of the mood in the quarters. "The girl Miriam is working a change on the others," he warned. "She does not work, she waits, and the others wait with her. There is a storm coming up from the swamp." Rourke sensed that by sending Miriam to the quarters, the Baron had inadvertently placed a spark in the tinderbox of the plantation's labor force. This period of separation lasted 3 weeks. It was a time of suspended animation, where the social order was stretched to its breaking point. The Baron believed he had won, that he had broken the bond by force. He did not understand that he had only clarified the stakes. By stripping away the comfort and the proximity, he had left the women with nothing but their essential need for each other. He had removed the fear of consequences, because for Isabel and Miriam, the separation was the worst possible consequence. The record of this fracture ends with the silence before the storm. The church had turned its back, the neighbors had closed their gates, and the estate was an island of misery. The stage was set for the final revelation, not by a gradual unveiling, but by a violent reclamation of the truth that had been hidden in the Baron's study for 20 years. The turning point of the tragedy is marked by a specific date, June 12, 1844. On this night, Isabel Harwood, emaciated from her hunger strike and fueled by the desperation of withdrawal from her sister, managed to pick the lock of her bedroom door. Instead of fleeing the house, she descended into the belly of the beast, the Baron's study. Her objective was not escape, but answers. She broke the glass of her father's private cabinet and retrieved a bound volume known as the Black Ledger. This book was not a financial record of the estate, but a confiscated journal belonging to old Sarah, the plantation's midwife who had died a year prior. The entry for October 14, 1823, is written in the crude, phonetic script of a woman who learned to read in secret. It provides the irrefutable evidence that dissolved the lies of Cypress Hollow. The ledger records 2 births occurring in the same room, mere hours apart. Entry 1. Midnight. Mistress Elizabeth, baby girl, strong lungs. Mother bleeding deep, gone by morning, named Isabel. Entry 2. Dawn. Corinne, seamstress. Baby girl, eyes the same as the first. Father S.H. present, he cursed the likeness, named Miriam. The horror of the revelation is compounded by a marginal note added years later in Silas Harwood's own handwriting, found in the margins of the midwife's book. "The likeness is an affliction," he wrote. "God has played a joke on my house. I have kept them close to watch the sin grow. One to rule, one to serve, mirrors facing each other in the dark." This note confirms that the Baron had engineered their lives as a cruel psychological experiment. He knew they were sisters. He knew they were identical in all but legal status. He had placed Miriam in Isabel's service not out of convenience, but out of a twisted desire to punish the product of his infidelity by making her serve the legitimate heir, forcing them to live as distorted reflections of one another. The impact of this discovery on Isabel can only be inferred from the carnage found in the study the next morning. Books were pulled from the shelves, maps were slashed, and the portrait of her father hanging over the mantel was stabbed repeatedly in the eyes, an echoing of the violence he had inflicted on the sketch years before. Isabel had found the source of her unnatural bond. It was not witchcraft, and it was not sickness. It was blood. The attraction she felt for Miriam, the intuitive connection, the sense of being halved. It was the cry of biology, recognizing itself across the artificial abyss of slavery. But there was a darker layer to the revelation. The romantic and sexual nature of their bond, which had terrified the governess and the overseer, was now revealed to be incestuous. The prohibited love was a double taboo. They were sisters who had become lovers, driven together by the very isolation the Baron had imposed. The ledger revealed that their love was a rebellion against the father who had tried to sever them, but it also confirmed the tragic, doomed nature of their connection. They were a closed loop, a genetic circuit that had shorted out the moral laws of their world. Isabel took the ledger and fled the main house, running through the dark toward the slave quarters. Witnesses described seeing a white wraith moving through the cypress trees. When she arrived at the shack where Miriam was being held, the reunion was not a tender embrace, but a collision. Isabel showed Miriam the book. The impact of the truth on Miriam is not recorded in words, but in action. The passive, silent shadow died in that moment, replaced by a woman armed with the knowledge of her own stolen birthright. The Black Ledger transformed the narrative from a Gothic romance to a forensic indictment of the patriarchy. It exposed the Baron not just as a cruel father, but as a manipulator of human life who had played God with his own children. He had created a monster of his own making, a two-headed entity that was now coming to claim its debt. The document proved that every rule in the house, every lock, every punishment had been designed to prevent this specific moment of recognition. By dawn, the women had returned to the main house together. They were no longer mistress and maid. They were the Harwood sisters, united by a truth that made them powerful and dangerous. They entered the house not as fugitives, but as executioners of the old order. The ledger was their weapon, a paper trail of the Baron's sins that stripped him of his moral authority before they even laid a hand on him. This block concludes with the terrifying clarity of their purpose. They did not plan to flee immediately. They planned to dismantle the lie where it lived. The irrefutable evidence had freed them from the roles of daughter and slave, leaving them as avenging angels in a house built on their own bones. The collapse of Silas Harwood's dominion is recorded in the official report filed by Sheriff Eustace Miller on June 14, 1844, a document currently housed in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The sheriff had been summoned by the overseer, Rourke, who reported a mutiny in the main house. When the sheriff arrived, he found the gates of Cypress Hollow wide open, the cotton fields abandoned, and an eerie silence hanging over the mansion. The Night of Broken Glass, as it came to be known in local lore, had left the estate a hollow shell. Miller's report describes entering the library to find a scene of bizarre and ritualistic judgment. Silas Harwood was alive, but he had been rendered utterly powerless. He was bound to his high-backed leather chair, not with rope, but with lengths of fine silk drapery, the same blue silk that had been used to decorate Isabel's room. His mouth was gagged with a strip of lace from a wedding veil, but the most disturbing detail was the room itself. Every portrait of the Harwood ancestors had been taken down from the walls and turned to face the wall. The Baron was forced to stare at the blank spaces where his legacy used to hang. On the desk in front of him lay two documents, drafted in Isabel's elegant handwriting, but signed with a shaky, terrified scrawl by the Baron. The first was a manumission of flesh, a legal deed granting immediate and unconditional freedom to Miriam Harwood, giving her the family name for the first time. The second was a transfer of deed, liquidating the entirety of Isabel's dowry, gold, bonds, and land titles, into bearer bonds payable to the holder. The Baron had been forced to sign away his power, his property, and his secret. The sheriff noted that the Baron was physically unharmed, but catatonic. His eyes were wide and fixed on the empty air, Miller wrote. He did not speak when the gag was removed. He merely pointed to the fireplace. In the hearth, the sheriff found the ashes of the Black Ledger. Udine. The women had used the proof of their lineage to extort their freedom, and then burned the evidence, leaving the Baron with the memory of his sin, but no way to prove why he had been destroyed. They had erased the history he had tried so hard to control. The collapse extended to the plantation's hierarchy. Rourke, the overseer, was found locked in the root cellar, terrified and rambling about, two demons with one face. He reported that the women had moved through the house with a terrifying calm, packing trunks and collecting valuables, moving in perfect synchronization. They didn't speak a word to each other, Rourke told the sheriff. They didn't have to. They moved like one person with four hands. The authority of the church and the state dissolved in the face of this private revolution. The sheriff, a man of the law, found himself unable to classify the crime. Was it robbery, kidnapping, or a domestic dispute? The documents were signed by the Baron. Technically, the manumission was legal. The transfer of funds was legal. The women had used the Baron's own laws against him, exploiting the absolute authority of the Patriarch to dismantle his kingdom. They had staged a coup d'état within the domestic sphere. The report captures the impotence of the officials. They launched a pursuit, but the delay caused by the confusion and the sheriff's reluctance to publicize the embarrassing details of the Baron's humiliation gave the women a head start. The collapse of authority was total. The Baron, the overseer, the law, all had been neutralized by the strategic brilliance of two women who had spent their lives watching the machinery of power from the inside. As the sheriff left the property, he noted a final symbolic detail. The iron bars on the nursery windows had been pried open from the inside, bent back with a leverage that seemed impossible for two young women. It was a physical testament to the force of their liberation. The cage was broken, and the birds had flown, taking the gold and the secrets of the Harwood name with them. The block ends with the image of Silas Harwood sitting alone in his ruined library, the sun setting on his empire. He had spent 20 years trying to keep his daughters apart, to save his reputation. In the end, his reputation was destroyed, his fortune was gone, and the daughters were united in a freedom he had paid for with his own sanity. For months, the trail of Isabel and Miriam seemed to vanish into the mist of the Mississippi River. The Baron, recovering his voice but not his mind, issued legal writs offering a staggering $1,000 reward for the return of his abducted daughter and the mad slave who had taken her. He framed the narrative as a kidnapping to save face, but the bounty hunters he hired knew they were hunting fugitives who were armed and dangerous. The trail went cold until the discovery of a logbook from the steamer the Delta Queen, found in a maritime auction in St. Louis in 1923. The logbook, kept by Captain Elias Thorne, records a voyage south to New Orleans in June of 1844. It lists 2 passengers who boarded at a wooding stop below Natchez under the cover of darkness. They were registered as Mrs. Isabel Harwood and her sister Miriam. This is the first recorded instance of Miriam using the title sister in a public document. It was a brazen declaration of their truth, hidden in plain sight on a riverboat manifest. Captain Thorne's personal notes in the margins of the log offer a glimpse into their life on the run. He describes them as refined but feral, women who kept to their cabin by day and walked the deck only at midnight. They speak in a code of touches, Thorne wrote. I have never seen 2 women so terrified and yet so peaceful. When a stranger approaches, they stand shoulder to shoulder and their hands locked together. It is a defensive formation. Thorne noted that they paid for their passage with a gold coin bearing the Harwood crest, a detail that confirms their identity. The riverboat journey represents the transition from the Gothic confinement of the plantation to the chaotic freedom of the wider world. The Mississippi River, a lawless artery of commerce and vice, offered them anonymity. On the boat, they were just 2 more travelers with a past to hide. Thorne observed that Miriam, though darker-skinned, carried herself with the same imperious grace as Isabel. If one did not know the laws of this land, the captain mused, one would swear they were twins born of a queen. The dark one commands the white one as often as the reverse. A specific incident recorded in the log highlights the danger they faced. A slave catcher boarding at Baton Rouge accosted Miriam on the deck, demanding to see her papers. Thorne records that before he could intervene, Isabel stepped forward, produced the manumission paper signed by the Baron and, according to the captain, looked the man in the eye with such a cold, aristocratic fury that he stepped back as if burned. Isabel used her privilege as a weapon to shield Miriam, flipping the racial hierarchy to protect her sister lover. The logbook also reveals that they were not heading for Europe or the North, as might be expected. They were heading for the borderlands. They asked the captain detailed questions about the Republic of Texas and the Mexican territories beyond. They were seeking a place where the laws of the United States, laws that defined Miriam as property and their love as a crime, did not apply. They were looking for a blank space on the map. The discovery of this source changes the texture of the story. It shows that they were not just fleeing, they were planning. They were navigating a hostile world with intelligence and courage. They were rewriting their identities in real time. The entry, Sister Miriam, in the logbook is a defiant act of self-naming. It is the moment they stopped being victims of the Baron's plot and became the authors of their own destiny. Captain Thorne's final entry regarding the pair is poignant. He let them off at the docks of New Orleans, a city teeming with bounty hunters. I watched them walk down the gangplank, he wrote. 2 women in dark cloaks holding hands, walking into the mouth of the wolf. I fear for them, but I do not pity them. They possess something that most men never find, a complete and total ally. This hidden source serves as the bridge between their past and their disappearance. It confirms their survival and their unity. It refutes the Baron's kidnapping story and establishes that they were partners in their escape. The river washed away their old names, and they stepped onto the muddy streets of New Orleans, ready to fight for the final leg of their journey. The hunt for Isabel and Miriam reached its fever pitch in the chaotic, plague-ridden streets of New Orleans. The Baron's writs had reached the city, and the posters offering the $1,000 reward were plastered on the walls of the French Quarter. The city was a trap closing in. The decision to make a final, decisive move is recorded not in a diary, but in the purchase records of a convent supply house and a letter intercepted by the Baron's agents years too late. The women realized they could not leave New Orleans by normal means. The port was watched, the trains were checked. They needed a disguise that would render them invisible to the male gaze of the bounty hunters. They chose the ultimate camouflage, the habit of the nun. Receipts show the purchase of heavy black wool and rosaries, but the justification for this action comes from a fragmented letter Isabel wrote to a contact in Texas, explaining their drastic choice. "We must become ghosts to be free," Isabel wrote. "The world looks at us and sees a crime. We must wear the cloth of holiness so they avert their eyes. We are leaving the world of men. We go to where the law is written in sand." This letter reveals the clarity of their desperation. They were willing to blaspheme, to impersonate brides of Christ, to escape the judgment of their Father. It was a pragmatic decision, but also symbolic. They were taking vows, not to the church, but to each other. The decision for decisive action involved a perilous transaction. They used the last of the Baron's gold to purchase passage on a mule train heading west towards the San Antonio Road, posing as sisters of the Ursuline order traveling to a mission. The risk was immense. Discovery meant not just capture, but likely death for Miriam and institutionalization for Isabel. The source describes them cutting their hair, the long locks of the Southern belle, and the servant shorn off and burned in a grate. This act of shearing was a ritual shedding of their old selves. Without the hair, without the silks, without the markers of their class and race, they became almost indistinguishable. The plan relied on the invisibility of nuns. In the 1840s, a nun was a figure of reverence and mystery. Men stepped aside, lowered their eyes, and did not ask for papers. It was a brilliant exploitation of religious deference to cover their sinful escape. The intercepted letter contains a line that speaks to the moral weight of their decision. "God will forgive us this lie," Isabel wrote, "for he made us this way. If it is a sin to love one's own soul, then let us be damned together." This is the justification, survival of the spirit over obedience to the law. They were choosing exile over separation. As they prepared to leave New Orleans, the Baron's agents were closing in on their boarding house. The narrative tension spikes as the document describes the near miss. The agents raided the room only hours after the sisters had departed. They found only the shorn hair on the floor, black and brown strands mixed together, indistinguishable in the pile. The mule train departure was the point of no return. They were leaving civilization, heading into the harsh, contested territories of the frontier. The decisive action was a commitment to a life of hardship. They were trading the comfort of the plantation for the dust of the road, but in doing so, they were keeping the only thing that mattered. This block underscores the agency of the women. They were not rescued, they rescued themselves. They used their wits, their resources, and their love to outmaneuver a system designed to crush them. The image of the two nuns riding out of New Orleans, pistols hidden under their habits, is the defining image of their rebellion. The trail of Isabel and Miriam effectively ends in the United States in 1844. For decades, their fate was a mystery, fueled by rumors and legends. It was not until 1985 that a doctoral student researching the history of the Ursuline order in New Orleans discovered a convent deposition misfiled in the archives. This document, sworn to the Mother Superior in July 1844, is the final confession of Isabel Harwood, given in exchange for the sanctuary and supplies they needed to flee. The deposition is a transcript of a conversation between Isabel and Mother Superior Marie-Thérèse. It's the only time the full truth was spoken aloud to a third party. In it, Isabel confesses everything: the blood relation, the romantic nature of their bond, the theft, and the deception. "He made us two halves of the same sin," Isabel told the nun. "We are simply returning the sin to him. We are not running from God, Mother. We are running to find a place where God might recognize us." The Mother Superior's notes on the confession are revealing. Instead of condemning the women, she offered them protection. "The bond between them is terrifying in its intensity," the nun wrote. "It is profound, unnatural, yet oddly pure. They look at each other with the eyes of the first humans, before the fall. I cannot judge them, for their suffering has already been their penance." The Church, usually the enforcer of morals, became their accomplice. The Mother Superior recognized that their monstrous love was, in fact, a desperate form of survival. The deposition confirms that they were aware of the biological implications of their relationship. Isabel admitted to the nun that they would never bear children. "Our line ends with us," she said. "We are the last of the Harwoods. The poison stops here." This admission reveals the moral weight they carried. They chose extinction over separation. They accepted that their love was a dead end biologically, but an infinite loop spiritually. The document also provides the final destination: Mexico, beyond the Rio Grande, to the high desert where the air is clean. Isabel expressed a desire to vanish into a landscape that was as empty and vast as their need for privacy. The Mother Superior gave them the habits and a letter of introduction to a mission in Coahuila, though she noted, "I do not think they will seek the church. They are their own church." This primary source recontextualizes the entire story. It is not just a tragedy, it is a spiritual journey. The confession shows Isabel taking ownership of her soul. She refuses to be ashamed. She presents her case to the nun not as a criminal seeking mercy, but as a human being seeking dignity. The Mother Superior's final act was to burn the Baron's wanted poster in the presence of the women. "Go," she told them, "and do not look back. Lot's wife turned to salt, but you have already walked through fire." Indeed, the deposition ends with a notation that they departed at dusk, hand in hand, into the silence of the West. This block serves as the emotional climax. The confession acts as a purging of the secrets. The final primary source provides the closure that the official records denied. It validates their love through the eyes of a holy woman who saw not sin, but suffering and grace. The aftermath of their escape was the slow, agonizing death of the Cypress Hollow estate. The 1850 census for Adams County lists Silas Harwood as living alone in the great mansion. The value of the estate had plummeted. The fields were overgrown. The workforce had been sold off or fled. The Baron is listed as insane in the remarks column. Neighbors reported that he had boarded up every window in the house and spent his days screaming at the mirrors, convinced that his daughters were trapping him inside the glass. In 1855, the final consequence of the tragedy arrived. On the anniversary of the girls' flight, a fire broke out in the main house. It started in the study, the site of the original sin. The mansion burned to the ground. Silas Harwood did not attempt to escape. His body was found in the ruins of the library, clutching a locket that contained a miniature portrait, not of Isabel, but of Miriam. In his madness, he had perhaps finally realized that the daughter he rejected was the one he truly feared losing. The Harwood line in America was extinguished. The land was sold to pay creditors and eventually subdivided. Today, nothing remains of the house but the overgrown foundation stones and the legend of the twin ghosts that is still whispered by the locals. The story became a cautionary tale in Natchez, a warning about the sins of the fathers and the dangers of unnatural affections. However, the legacy of Isabel and Miriam continued elsewhere. No death certificates were ever issued for them in the United States. They simply ceased to exist in the American record. But in the oral histories of the borderlands, traces of them began to appear. Tales of two healing women who arrived in the desert, speaking French and English, women who never married and lived in absolute isolation. The documented consequences show the total destruction of the patriarchy that tried to crush them. The Baron lost everything, his heirs, his home, his mind, and his legacy. The women, by contrast, gained their freedom. The destruction of the house was the final punctuation mark on their sentence. They had dismantled the master's house using the master's tools. The story also left a scar on the community. The Black Ledger incident forced a reckoning among the local families, many of whom harbored their own secrets about illicit lineages. The Harwood scandal exposed the fragility of the racial and social lines they drew. If a slave could be the sister of the mistress, then the entire foundation of their society was built on a lie. The legacy of the story is one of silence and fire. The silence of the sisters who kept their secret, and the fire that consumed the evidence. It is a story that refuses to stay buried, resurfacing in the whispers of the river and the archives of the convent. It reminds us that history is not just what is written by the victors, it is what is survived by the victims. Decades later, in 1890, a folklore study regarding a remote village in Coahuila, Mexico, uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. The study mentioned Las Dos Madres, the two mothers, strange, reclusive healers who had lived in an adobe house on the edge of the desert for 40 years. They were known for their identical features and their refusal to be separated. When one died of old age, the villagers said the other lay down beside her and stopped breathing within the hour, not from illness, but from the cessation of will. In the dusty cemetery of that village stands the stone described at the beginning of our story. The engraving of the two trees from a single root is the only epitaph they chose. It is a symbol of their life, distinct but inseparable, grounded in the same soil. The historian who found the grave noted that there were no names, only the date of their arrival, 1844. This grave confirms that they succeeded. They lived a full life, free from the Baron, free from the laws of Mississippi, free from the judgment of the world. They created a sanctuary in the desert where they could simply be. The horror of their origin, the incest, the slavery, the manipulation, was transmuted into a quiet, enduring peace. But the story leaves us with an open question, a haunting ambiguity that lingers like the river fog. Did they ever find redemption? Or did they live under the weight of their sin until the end? The ledger was burned, the confession was sealed, and their voices are silent. We are left only with the evidence of their courage and the mystery of their bond. Perhaps the true horror is not what they did, but what was done to them. The macabre mystery is not the love between sisters, but the system that made such love their only refuge. The Harwood tragedy forces us to look at the darkness of the past and ask, who were the true monsters? The women who broke the law to survive, or the men who wrote the laws to destroy them? The wind blows through the cypress trees of Natchez and the mesquite of Coahuila, carrying the same whisper. Some bonds cannot be broken by man, by law, or by death. The Baron's daughter and the slave sister found their answer in each other, and in doing so, they defied the world. If this story of the Harwood sisters has chilled you to the bone, or if you believe that some truths are destined to be revealed, no matter how deep they are buried, subscribe to Before the Story. Click the bell icon to be notified when we unlock the next file from the archives of the macabre. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the Baron got the justice he deserved, or was his punishment too cruel? We will see you in the next investigation. Sleep well, if you can.